As you can see here, the topic of my talk is Corpus Linguistics in Onomastics. I will have a short theoretical section on names and meaning, and then talk in the methodological section more specifically about corpus linguistics. And then I will also try to illustrate this by having my own corpus-based analysis of English country names as a case study. Yeah, so what is the issue that I would like to raise here? Of course, we have many research methods that we use in onomastics, and they are very good methods to help us find out things about the meaning of names, about their morphology, etymology, their social relevance, and their geographical distribution, for example. And I'm not disputing this in any way. This is all good and useful work. But you also have to see that many of these studies actually study names in isolation. So they are not really looking at how names are used within a linguistic context. So I think there's an additional perspective that could maybe come a little bit more to the fore in onomastics in the future, and that is how names are actually used in texts or in talk. So the question then is, how are names linguistically embedded? And I think corpus linguistics is a method that would give us access to this additional perspective. Now, what is a corpus? Of course, the word corpus has been around for quite some time, and there are different senses of the word. In onomastics, more specifically, we sometimes talk about a corpus for any list of names as onomastic data. This list may be historical and non-computerized, but this is obviously not the kind of corpus that we would be working with in corpus linguistics. Here, the definition of a collection of textual data, which is machine readable and contains names as parts of larger syntactic constructions, would be the sense of corpus that we would be working with. And we would be working with that to find evidence on how names are actually used. So when we dive more specifically into the topic of names and meaning, all of you know that traditionally speaking, names have been described as rigid designators because they are said to refer directly to a certain entity, and they're said to have no lexical meaning. But there are also more recent approaches to this, and one of them is called the pragmatic approach, which proposes that there are two types of referential mode, the onymic mode and the semantic mode. And this means that when we look at how the forms that we consider to be names and how they are used, you will find that some of these uses are not really onymic. They are not really used like proper names, but rather like common nouns. And this is what is then called the semantic referential mode. Now, we can group together all of these different usage types and form what is called a proprial lemma. And this also tells us that properhood as a linguistic function in a way is not really tied to particular forms. It's actually something that unfolds in context in a way. So you can see this here, that when we have a sentence like we went to Greece, Greece is clearly used as a proper name. But in other contexts, Greece may be used in different ways, where it has metaphorical, metonymic, or partitive meanings, and then we are in the semantic referential mode. Right, so when we talk about the grammar of names, we would have to say that we still have a fairly limited picture of how names are actually used. Of course, we do have descriptions of name grammar, so to speak, but they are strongly influenced by standard language norms. So these descriptions are rather about how names should be used, ideally, than how they're actually used in concrete language data. So I think corpus linguistics can give us here a more accurate picture, because it would also give us access to less common and non-standard uses in which names are involved. So if we focus a little bit more specifically on definite article use with English names, a traditional account of this would be that some name groups take the definite article and some don't. So if you think about place names, for example, you have certain subgroups here, the names of cities, lakes, streets, squares, parks, islands, and counties. They would generally not take a definite article, but other geographical names like names of rivers, oceans, channels, and deserts, they would typically take a definite article. So you get these sorts of descriptions. But of course, when you look at actual language use, the situation is a little bit more complex than that. So this is a fairly normative account of what's going on And it basically ignores the intracategorial variance that we find in actual language data. So within the group of lake names or street names, there may be individual group members that behave differently than the overall group. Right, this is why it's interesting to focus on country names, actually, at least in English, because they show a higher degree of internal variance with respect to their grammatical behavior. We see this, for example, in their pronominalization. So you can pronominalize country names with it, with he, and with they. Or in terms of number agreement and verbs, they can go with singular or plural agreement. Or there's competition between genitive constructions, the S genitive versus the of construction. And the one feature that I focus on is the definite article. So that's the question, is it used or not? So of course, there's been earlier research on this, and these are the people who have carried out this research. And what they found was that the dropping of the article corresponds to a growing perceived human association of a geographical entity through nation building processes. So the default process seems to be that we have an extension of a geographical name to a country name. So we have names of rivers or regions, and at some point these names are also used to refer to countries. And if the original name goes with a definite article, it's also likely that at least in the beginning, the country name also goes with a definite article. But then we have normally what is called analogical language change, because country names by default are without definite article. These names may also lose the article throughout time. It's also important to note that article use with country names is nowadays often avoided because it has negative connotations. So if you think of phrases like the Congo or the Ukraine, this sometimes has a colonial or outdated flavor, and this is also why many people tend to avoid articles with country names today. Now, the earlier research literature has identified 4 categories here and related these to article use. So we have category 1, that's monomorphemic forms, cases like Greece and Japan and Spain. Then we have suffixed forms in category 2, Germany, Slovakia, Afghanistan, and so on. Category 3 are names with a pre-post definite article, the Congo, the Ukraine, the Vatican. And category 4 would be names incorporating a classifier noun plus a definite article, the Czech Republic, the United Kingdom, and so on. Again, this is a fairly normative account of what's going on, and we will see that in each of these categories, we have a certain degree of variation going on in actual language data. Right, however, virtually all country names are used to some extent in the syntactic position after the definite article. So that was interesting to see in my study. There was actually only 1 country name that never occurred after a definite article. Right, so when we do corpus linguistics, obviously the first thing we need to do is select a certain data set that we can analyze, and I used the corpus of contemporary American English for my study, which is still one of the major reference corpora for English. When I conducted my study, the corpus size was 520 million words with data covering period from 1990 to 2015. And the text categories in the corpus are in the domains fiction, popular magazines, newspapers, academic texts, and spoken to equal proportions, that is. So my research interest was in what are the factors that cause variance in article use with the country names. So I'm conducting a systematic frequency analysis of the usage patterns of country names in American English. So when you do corpus linguistics, of course, you also need to be aware of what you're actually doing. And this also means that you need to be aware of the fact that when you do corpus search queries, they are necessarily based on linguistic forms, especially when you're working with an unannotated corpus. You can only search for linguistic forms rather than linguistic functions. This is also relevant for onomastics because properhood is actually a functional aspect rather than a formal aspect. And that means that our access to linguistic functions through corpora is always indirect through linguistic forms, because the linguistic forms we can easily incorporate in our search queries. This also means that we need to have a good understanding of what is called form to function mapping before we do our queries. And in onomastics, this has something to do with the appropriate lemma again, because if you just search for a certain name using a corpus tool, and you create a search query with that name, you have to be aware of the fact that you will retrieve both onymic and semantic referential uses of this name. This is maybe not such a big problem and maybe negligible, because you will see that the semantic references are usually in the minority. Maybe they make up like 2 or 3% of all hits. So maybe you could argue this is negligible. And another aspect that deserves maybe greater attention is that we may have problems concerning homographs. So sometimes a country name is homographic with a common noun, and then of course you also need to do something to rule out the common nouns from your hits. So what did I actually do? I performed searches for all names of existing countries and also countries that still existed in the 1990s, simply because the COCA data also covered the 1990s. And therefore, I performed an initial COCA search with all names in isolation first to determine the frequency of each country name. And for the ones that have common noun homographs, I included an additional part of speech tag in my search query, so that I only got the proper noun hits there. These are cases like China or Turkey, which are homographs with common nouns. Then I restricted myself to country names that occurred less than 100 times. No, I excluded these that occurred less than 100 times in the corpus, but this only affected like 4 or 5 names. All of the others occur more than 100 times. And in the end, I had a list of 200 country names that I could use for my study. Then I performed a second search query in combination with a definite article for each of the names, and this enabled me to determine the percentage of article-based usages for each name. As I also wanted to relate this to name morphology, I set up a classification of the morphological structure of names. So I also had monomorphemic names, that's about 1/3 of the names on my list. Suffixed names, that's 52% of the list, and then smaller groups for names incorporating a classifier noun like Czech Republic or United States, names specified by an adjective like North Korea or South Africa, and abbreviated names like USA and UK. So coming to my actual analysis, first some initial findings here. As I said before, I found that all country names except one occurred at least once with a definite article. The country name that didn't do that was Latvia. I don't know why that is the case, just for you to know. But on the other hand, there was also no country name that occurred invariably after the definite article. So we can see from the start that there is a variance going on. 74% of the names occurred with a definite article in less than 4% of their usages. And for 76 out of the 200 names, it was even less than 1%. So we can clearly see that there's a majority of names that tends to go without the definite article, even though this is not absolute. Right, so this table shows you the names of the countries that have higher definite article rates of 10% or higher. And if we focus on the ones that have 22.5% or higher, you will see that most of them belong to 3 groups, namely plural forms such as Bahamas and Netherlands, then the names incorporating classifier nouns like United States and Marshall Islands, and abbreviations like USA and UK. So they systematically seem to go with higher definite article rates. And then there are a couple of others in the list, for example, Gambia, Congo, and Uruguay. And here it's interesting to note that all 3 of these names were originally river names, and rivers by default go with a definite article. So that's maybe not surprising that it is these 3 that also show up in the list. And in fact, I cannot even rule out that some of the hits in my corpus were references to the rivers rather than to the countries. So that may also explain why they have higher rates of definite article use. Right, we also need to be aware of the fact that there are certain syntactic contexts that actually demand the use of the definite article. So I inspected some concordance lines and found out that these are contexts in which the definite article seems to be invariably used. This is true here for usage types A to C, where the country name is a specifier within a nominal compound, cases like the Iraq War or the Iraq National Museum or the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. So in these, of course, the article marks the definiteness of the compound, not of the country name. And in types D to F, we have the country name being followed by a restrictive modifier. This could be a prepositional phrase or a relative clause, like in the Iraq of our dreams or the Iraq he knows. And here, the article marks the definiteness of the country name as such, and these are all cases of semantic reference rather than onymic. So as these are contexts that do not seem to allow for variation, I excluded them from my following analysis, because if you want to find out about variation, it doesn't make sense to look at the context where you don't have variation. So in the end, I had 115 country names that occurred with the article at least 25 times, and I concentrate on these now. And I excluded the grammatical context that I just showed you on the previous slide. And this gave me this list of countries that have at least, well, 50% of definite article use or more. And again, you will see it's the same three groups that are salient here, and one smaller group of other names, namely Ukraine, Vatican, Gambia, Sudan, Congo, and Cote d'Ivoire, that also have fairly high rates. Here are some examples from the corpus so that you can see how these country names are used with a definite article. This is just for the sake of illustration. Maybe the Congo example is interesting because it's like a coordinated structure, and it says Cuba, the Congo, and Vietnam. So the other two country names are not with a definite article. That's maybe interesting. Right, so if when I quantified this in relation to the morphological categories, this is what I found. So you see here the box plots indicate how frequently we find the definite article with these name categories. So you see here category 5, which is names having an adjectival specifier. Like in North Korea, they have the lowest definite article rate. Then category 2, the suffix forms also have very low rates, but you see that there are quite a few outliers here. The dots on top of the boxes are the outliers. And also for monomorphemic names, category 1, we have low definite article rates. On the other hand, we have very high article rates for names involving classifier nouns like Czech Republic, and for the abbreviated names. I wanted to look a little bit more closely at the suffix names because there were so many outliers here, and a substantial amount of names that behave differently from the category overall. So I also quantified this for the individual suffixes that we find in names. And here you see that it's basically the same for most suffixes. They don't go that much with the definite article. And it's only the plural suffix s that tends to go with the use of the definite article. Okay, coming to my conclusion. We saw that name morphology is a central factor affecting definite article use with country names. It was monomorphemic names and suffix names and names with adjectival modifiers that tended to avoid the article, even though this is not absolute. On the other hand, names with classifier nouns, plural forms, and abbreviations tended to take the article, again, not absolute. If we compare these two groups, there is maybe a tiny semantic difference between them, and group 2 seems to be more associated with collective meanings that are maybe in greater need of individuation through the definite article. Also looking at the monomorphemic and suffix names, it was interesting to see that the variance that we saw there was sometimes caused by an extension of other geographical name types to country names. Of course, we need much more research on this, and especially also on other languages. I just briefly thought about German and French. In German, the situation seems to be completely different, and it seems to be governed by grammatical gender. So it would be interesting to learn more about this also from other languages. Finally, relating this to corpus linguistics more broadly, I hope that I could show with my study that corpus linguistics is a useful but currently still underexplored research method in onomastics. The studies that we already have in onomastics that use corpus linguistics, they mainly conduct frequency analyses. And this is also what I have done in my study. But actually, corpus linguistics does much more than that. So actually, there would be many different types of analysis that would maybe also merit greater attention in the future. I'm talking about concordance analysis, for example. You could inspect the syntactic usage context of names to find out about their typical constructions and semantic prosodies. You could conduct collocation analyses to find out with which forms names co-occur, or you could compare corpora and also compare the usage frequencies of names across corpora. And there are probably still more types of analysis that could be interesting. And if we do all of that, I think we could gain a better understanding of how the lexical, grammatical, and extralinguistic context shapes the use of names. And this was something that I wanted to induce with my article. Let me just add a few words of thank you at the end. So thank you very much for awarding me the Best Article of the Year award. So my thanks go out to the American Name Society for that, obviously. Also for inviting me to present at this conference. I would like to thank Nick for being such a hardworking and devoted editor of the journal Names. I would like to thank all the editorial board members of the journal and everybody who voted for my article. This really means a lot to me. And I also have to thank my workplaces that I worked at the last 4 years or so, because they provided the infrastructure for the research that I've published in this article. That's Goethe University Frankfurt, Florida Atlantic University, and Western Norway University of Applied Sciences in Bergen. Thank you so much to all of you. And I end with a little bit of advertising because my new book has just come out. It's not on names, unfortunately, but it has something to do with corpus linguistics at least. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Heiko. That was great. So we've got some time for questions. I noticed that Don had put a question in the chat here saying contrast the United States, meaning America, with the United States, not necessarily America. How does that affect capitalization? How does that work?
In fact, let me ask the question a little bit more.
Sure.
Give you a little more context. In my classes, we talk about capitalization, and we talk for phrases. We talk about capitalization and word stress of phrases. And so we have a difference between a White House and the White House, a greenhouse and a greenhouse, a yellow jacket versus a yellow jacket, a bluebird versus a bluebird. And that relates to the question I'm asking, which relates to the United States, which is capitalized, and the United States, which is not capitalized. Could you talk about both capitalization of phrases, capitalization and word stress as it relates to whether something is a proper noun or a common noun?
Right, you probably mean in relation to my search queries, right?
Yes.
Yes. Obviously for my search queries, I made sure that I only get the capitalized uses. I was not aware that there are also decapitalized usages if it's used as a name. And then, of course, what you can also do is add a part of speech tag again that tells you you only want the proper name uses of these forms. So that's all possible in a search query.
But it seems to me that sometimes if you use a definite article with uncapitalized words, it's still kind of a proper noun in a way. It really restricts it to a single individual, maybe.
Could you give me an example of this?
Well, the United States without capitals. It could refer to the United States, but it doesn't have to. I don't know. I was just wondering if in your corpus search, you might consider searching also non-capitals to see what's going on there with the definite article and phrases. Yeah,
maybe I have to do that. I didn't do it.
I understand.
I wasn't aware that if it's used as a country name, that it can also be decapitalized in written text. So
okay, thank you.
Sorry, I ignored that then.
Okay.
We have another question in the chat from Rebecca, who says, have you seen any correlation between the morphology of determiner plus place and determiner plus proper name of the group of people? I know you touched upon this briefly, but was wondering if you could expand upon this.
Could you repeat that question, please?
Sure, it's in the chat. It might be easier for you to read it than for me to read it out for you. It's the correlation between the morphology of determiner plus place and determiner plus proper name of a group of people.
I can expand upon that further if need be. One of the reasons that I'm asking has to do with this method of naming, in which one is naming for a group of people rather than you know, for example, a descriptive place name. And I'm just wondering if there might be some overlap there in terms of the morphology and using a determiner.
Do you have an example of this where it overlaps?
Only from my own research, which is based on Ganyageha here, the Mohawk language here in North America. And so, for example, Tutelo is one that was originally used as just the location of a group of people. In other words, it was used on a map to indicate the location for those people, and then became the place name. And it's a little complicated in that a determiner would not have been used in Mohawk. Rather, that would have been a suffix, a populative suffix, but it was in English and then eventually became simply the proper name. And I'm just wondering if you'd seen anything similar to this in your research.
Yeah, thanks for pointing this out. I can't think of any example for country names, to be honest, but if it is like that, of course, I would have to cater for this somehow. You're right. I think most of the countries have names that are different from the names of the people who inhabitate the countries. At least I can't think of an example now that would go into that direction.
France, for example, although it's been France for so long that one would not necessarily think to necessarily look for the Franks as being indicative of that, but you know, that's just my work tends to be a lot more historical than anything else. So I wonder if that's kind of part of what's.
So would that mean that you can say the France for the people who live in France?
No, the French.
The French, yeah, but that's a different form.
Right, but I'm wondering then what historically what that may have looked like, which obviously would have to go and look at a historical corpus.
Right, this is not what I looked at, I'm sorry. I just did these corpus searches, and for that, obviously, there it's clear that you cannot say the France and then you mean the people who live there. So I think I was pretty safe in that respect for my corpus at least.
Okay, no, thanks. I was just wondering if you'd noticed that at all.
Yeah, that's a good
Thanks
point.
for the comment.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the importance of corpus analysis historically, as well as what's happening right now, right? You want to take a longer view to see what might have changed over time. So there is so much that could be done with corpora. So it's at 2 o'clock and we're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much, Heiko. That was great. Great questions, everybody. Thank you.